Night in the Mississippi woods carried a strange heaviness in the summer of 1864, a kind that clung to the skin like damp breath. Samuel Dorsey felt it the moment he stepped off the dirt road and into the tree line, where even the crickets stopped singing as though startled by his arrival. The sky above him glowed a faint bruised purple, and the forest swayed with a slow, uneasy rhythm, whispering as if rehearsing secrets meant for someone else. He had heard stories of these woods, stories the locals muttered with their eyes lowered, as though the very air might carry their words back to something listening, but he hadn't believed them until now. Something about the silence felt expectant, like a held breath. He followed the faint glow of lanterns flickering deeper between the trees, though no human hand seemed to carry them. They bobbed like restless souls, their light too cold to be fire and too steady to be moonshine. Every few yards, Samuel thought he heard soft voices drifting between the trunks. Not conversation, pleading. Women's voices overlapping in a kind of mournful chorus that rose and dissolved before he could decide whether it was real or some trick of exhaustion. The ground beneath him sloped downward into a ravine, where the air grew heavy with the scent of wet clay and rotting magnolia petals. A structure emerged from the gloom, enormous and sagging, its once white columns stained brown like old bones. The mansion looked abandoned by everything except darkness. Vines crawled up its walls like veins, windows were blackened with grime, and yet every instinct told Samuel he was being watched from behind them. As he stepped closer, the porch boards groaned, not from his weight, but as though someone else walked there unseen. The front door opened with a low moan before he even touched it, revealing a corridor lit by a single trembling lantern. At the far end, something moved. Something large. The faint wheels of a rolling chaise whispered across the floor, followed by the slow, strained breath of the woman seated upon it. Her silhouette filled the hallway, wide and heavy, her head tilted as though listening to distant cries only she could hear. Samuel froze when her eyes met his, pale, hungry, almost luminous. She did not smile. She merely lifted a hand, swollen and ghostly, and pointed toward the woods behind him. The voices rose again, louder this time, though the lips producing them were nowhere in sight. They didn't warn him. They begged him. And in their trembling chorus, he felt a truth settle cold and merciless into his bones: whatever lived within these woods was not finished speaking, and whatever waited inside the mansion had been waiting for him. Samuel Dorsey's arrival in the Mississippi woods began not with intention but with exhaustion, hunger, and the kind of wandering that comes from having nowhere left to go. He had spent weeks drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs and sleeping in barns, staying ahead of a war-torn country that seemed to swallow up every place he paused for too long. By the time he reached the outskirts of Madison County, his boots were splitting at the seams, and his throat burned with thirst. The late summer heat pressed down on him like a smothering hand, and the only shade he could find lay beneath the dark fringe of the woods stretching endlessly along the dirt road. Locals had warned him in quick, clipped tones not to stray too far beneath those trees, but they never explained why. Their eyes darted to the ravine beyond the tree-line, then quickly away, as though memory itself carried teeth. When Samuel stepped into the woods, he felt an immediate shift, as though he had crossed a boundary not meant to be touched. The air grew cooler yet strangely dense, the sounds of the outer world fading until only the faint rustle of leaves remained. He followed the narrow path not because he trusted it, but because the forest felt strangely organized around him, as if the trees leaned just enough to guide his direction. After an hour, he stumbled upon a small clearing where a man no older than 40 sat whittling near a dying fire. His clothes were patched, his expression hollowed by sleeplessness. When Samuel greeted him, the man barely lifted his head before asking, in a strangely brittle whisper, whether Samuel had come looking for work or whether he was simply lost. Samuel explained he was seeking shelter, a place to rest for the night, but the man shook his head sharply, insisting no decent soul lingered in those woods after dusk. Before Samuel could question him further, the man leaned closer, eyes flickering nervously toward the shadows, and muttered the name, Madam Calhoun. The way he said it made Samuel's skin tighten. The name carried a weight, as though speaking it too loudly might summon something listening. The men told him of a woman, an enormous lonely figure who lived deep in the ravine, who was known for taking in pregnant enslaved women, promising comfort and safety, only for them to vanish without a trace. Their cries, he said, still drifted through the woods at night, echoing between the trees long after their bodies were gone. He urged Samuel to turn back, to leave the county entirely, but Samuel, despite feeling the tremor of fear beneath the man's words, found himself compelled to understand what kind of presence could inspire such dread. The warning only deepened the pull of the path ahead, setting in motion a mystery he was no longer certain he wanted to uncover. Rumors of the vanished voices clung to the Mississippi woods like fog, whispered in taverns, murmured on porches, and traded between neighbors who refused to speak above a hush when the subject surfaced. Samuel first sensed the weight of these stories long before he ever reached the ravine. It hung on the expressions of the people he met, in their cautious glances toward the tree line, in the way conversations would abruptly end when someone mentioned missing women. These were not ordinary disappearances. They carried a chilling uniformity that made them impossible to dismiss as misfortune or wandering. Each woman had been pregnant, each had been taken to Madam Calhoun's mansion under the promise of rest and care, and each had vanished as though swallowed by the land itself. Yet long after their bodies were gone, their voices remained, drifting through the woods with unsettling clarity. Samuel heard these accounts first from a trembling young woman in a roadside inn who had once worked at the Calhoun estate. She described nights when the wind carried sounds that weren't quite screams but weren't entirely human either, cries that rose and fell like distant labor pains, echoing from the direction of the ravine. She said the sound made the dogs hide under porches and the birds abandon their nests. Elderly men who had lived in the county their entire lives spoke of hearing the same voices decades earlier, suggesting the disappearances had been happening far longer than anyone dared admit. The rumor that chilled Samuel most came from a preacher who claimed he'd found footprints in the woods, bare, small, and countless, trailing through the mud long after the women were presumed dead. The tracks, he said, always led toward the mansion. Never away. Some townsfolk believed Madam Calhoun was simply cruel or mad, but others whispered of darker possibilities, suggesting she was performing unholy acts that tethered the voices of the women to the forest. They spoke of hearing lullabies sung in trembling tones, lullabies that no one recognized but all felt compelled to avoid. Some insisted the voices grew louder during storms, as if the sky itself helped carry them. One farmer swore he'd heard his deceased wife calling his name from the woods at midnight, though she had never set foot on Calhoun land. It was as if the forest had begun collecting grief, shaping it into echoes that no living ear should ever hear. Samuel tried to dismiss these tales as superstition fueled by fear and isolation, yet the more he listened, the more he felt the woods absorbing each whispered detail until the truth of the matter pressed against him like a cold hand. The voices were not imagined. They were not tricks of the wind. They were warnings left behind by those who had disappeared, their suffering imprinted onto the land, urging anyone who ventured near the ravine to turn back before they too became part of the forest's mournful chorus. Samuel first saw the mansion when the woods grew unnaturally still, as though nature itself were holding its breath. He had been following the faint impressions of old wagon tracks, half swallowed by mud and creeping vines, when the ground dipped sharply beneath him. The path narrowed into a steep descent, the soil darkening into clay so dense it stained his boots with every step. The ravine felt carved out not by water or time but by something deliberate, a hollowed cradle where sunlight rarely reached. As he moved deeper, the trees began to change, taller, thinner, their branches twisted in shapes that resembled reaching arms. Even the birds avoided this part of the forest, leaving behind an oppressive silence broken only by the slow crunch of leaves under Samuel's feet. When the mansion finally emerged from behind the thicket, he stopped as if struck. It rose like a carcass of the past, enormous and skeletal, its columns sinking unevenly into the ravine floor. The once grand estate looked as though it had been dragged downward by the weight of its own secrets, its roof bowed and shingles dangling like broken teeth. Moss clung to every inch of the structure, dripping in long, sickly strands from the eaves. Wide windows stared blankly out toward the woods, their glass stained dark with age, giving the unsettling impression of eyes that watched without blinking. Even from a distance, Samuel sensed the house wasn't merely abandoned. It was patient. The air around the mansion carried a strange dampness, thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Samuel felt it settle in his throat, making his breath shallow. He noticed, with growing unease, that the forest seemed to retreat from the house. The trees bent away from it, their roots curling outward as if refusing to touch the soil too near the foundation. No grass grew in the yard, only bare earth, cracked and dark, as though scorched by something unseen. A series of narrow paths fanned outward from the back of the mansion toward the deeper woods, paths so worn they looked like the trails of creatures circling their lair. But what unsettled Samuel the most was the sensation of being drawn closer despite every instinct urging him to stop. The house exuded a pull, a quiet, magnetic force that made him feel as though turning back would almost be a betrayal of something watching him from within. Each creak of the ravine floor seemed to echo in his ears, mimicking footsteps behind him even when he stood still. As he took a hesitant step onto the rotted front porch, he felt a tremor ripple through the wooden planks, not from his weight, but from something shifting deep inside the structure itself, as if the mansion were stretching awake after a long, starving sleep. Samuel had braced himself for the desolation of an abandoned mansion, but nothing could have prepared him for the figure that emerged from the dim corridor like a ghost too heavy to drift. At first he heard her before he saw her, the slow scrape of wheels against warped floorboards, the faint, labored hitch in breathing that seemed to rattle the air. Shadows shifted along the walls, gathering into a hulking silhouette that grew larger with each second. When she finally rolled into view, Samuel instinctively took a step back. The woman was enormous, her body spilling over the sides of a specially crafted wheeled chaise that groaned under her weight. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in places, stretched thin over her swollen face and hands, giving her the appearance of a wax figure left too close to the fire. Her hair, once likely rich and thick, hung in limp, matted strands around her shoulders, and her dark gown clung tightly to her figure as though holding her shape together. Her eyes, however, were the most arresting part of her. They were pale to the point of appearing silver, unblinking and strangely reflective, as if some light inside her mind glowed and pressed against them. When those eyes locked onto Samuel, he felt a jolt of discomfort so sharp it nearly forced breath from his lungs. She studied him with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the intensity of someone who had forgotten what it meant to look at another human without imagining what they could take from them. Her gaze drifted briefly to his hands, then lower, as though measuring the health of his body, the strength of his bones, the warmth of his blood. Samuel wanted to speak, to introduce himself, but the words dried up when she raised one swollen hand. Her fingers were thick and discolored at the joints, yet her movement was oddly graceful, almost commanding. She pointed toward the woods behind him with a slow, deliberate arc, as though brushing away a veil only she could see. Samuel followed her gesture, expecting to find someone else there, but the woods remained silent and empty. When he turned back, she was smiling, barely, faintly, but unmistakably. A strange, knowing curl of the lips that implied she had heard something he had not, something calling from beyond the tree line. A soft creak echoed from deep within the mansion, and she tilted her head, listening with an intensity that told Samuel the sound was more than a noise to her, it was a signal, a message, perhaps even a summons. Her breath quickened, and her eyes grew brighter, almost feverishly alert. Samuel felt the temperature around him drop as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He realized with a sinking feeling that this woman, this strange, monstrous presence known as Madam Calhoun, was not merely living in the mansion. She was fused to it, a living extension of its hunger, and whatever she listened for in the dark was far more terrifying than her gaze could ever be. The first time Samuel heard the ground tremble beneath the mansion, he thought it was thunder rolling in from the distant hills. The sound was low and rhythmic, like the distant rumble of a storm too sluggish to break. But when he stepped closer to the parlor floor, he felt the vibration pulse through the soles of his boots with an unnerving steadiness that had nothing to do with weather. It was a slow, muffled pounding, almost like someone striking wood from beneath. He froze, listening as the vibrations traveled from one end of the house to the other, weaving through the floorboards in a pattern too deliberate to be random. The noise grew louder, then softer, as though something alive was moving under the foundation in a steady, measured cadence. Madam Calhoun's reaction made the moment even stranger. She didn't flinch. She didn't appear startled or confused. Instead, her breathing slowed, her gaze sharpened, and a faint, unsettling smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She tilted her head as if savoring each pulse, like a mother listening to the heartbeat of a child she carried. Samuel watched her pale fingertips brush lazily along the armrest of her chaise, following the rhythm as if keeping time with it. The gesture sent a shiver up his spine. Whatever was making the sound, whatever lived beneath that floor, she expected it. Perhaps even welcomed it. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving the house in a silence so deep it made Samuel's ears ring. But the quiet didn't bring comfort. It felt like something had paused to listen, perhaps even to sense where he stood. The air grew thick, heavy enough that Samuel tasted dust rising from the cracks between the planks. A moment later, a second tremor shuddered through the floor, lighter this time, almost hesitant. The boards beneath his feet gave a faint groan, as though stretched by a shifting weight. This was no animal burrowing, no shifting earth. It was movement with intention. Instinct urged him to step back, but curiosity rooted him to the spot. He crouched, placing his hand flat against the wooden floor. The heat shocked him. The boards were warm, far warmer than the cool, damp air of the ravine should allow. Something pulsed beneath his palm, not quite a heartbeat, but close enough to send a jolt of dread through his arm. Madam Calhoun let out a soft hum, a sound disturbingly close to contentment, and murmured something too quiet for him to catch, though her tone suggested she was answering a voice only she could hear. Samuel stood, throat tightening, watching dust settle from the rafters. It struck him then that the mansion was not merely sinking into the ravine, it was alive with movement, with breath, with something buried under the floorboards struggling to rise. And the most terrifying part was the certainty that Madam Calhoun was waiting for that struggle to break the surface. Samuel had hoped the strange pounding beneath the mansion was the worst of what the estate hid, but as unease wound tighter around him, he knew he needed answers. That need, mixed with fear and a growing sense that the house itself watched him, pushed him to explore further. He waited until Madam Calhoun drifted into one of her strange, trance-like silences before slipping down a narrow hallway he had not yet dared to enter. The corridor was lined with portraits whose faces had faded into ghostly smears, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved deeper into the mansion's interior. A cold draft seeped from beneath a crooked door at the far end, carrying the faint smell of rust and something sour beneath it. When he pushed the door open, he found a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the walls damp enough to glisten in the glow of the candle he carried. It was not the chill that unnerved him, but the feeling that the very stones around him absorbed sound, swallowing each footfall before it could echo. At the bottom of the stairs, the space widened into a sprawling cellar. At first, Samuel thought he'd entered some kind of storage room, but as the candlelight spread, the shapes around him sharpened into horrifying detail. Rows of old birthing chairs, each fitted with metal restraints, stood in the shadows like skeletal sentinels. Their leather straps were cracked but unmistakably stained, the residue of past suffering preserved in the cold air. Rusted tools, some medical, some inexplicably crude, hung from hooks along the wall, their shapes too varied to guess their precise purpose. Samuel's breath hitched when he noticed the jars. Dozens of glass jars lined a slanted shelf, their contents suspended in murky liquid. Some held unfamiliar tissues twisted into unrecognizable forms, others contained fragments that looked disturbingly like tiny limbs, curled as if in sleep. Dust coated the shelves, but the jars were clean, recently handled. A makeshift table stood at the center of the room, its surface stained with something dark and flaking, as though the remnants of past rituals had never been properly scrubbed away. A faint circular pattern marked the floor beneath it, carved or worn into the stone from repeated use. Whatever had happened here was not abandoned. It was active. He moved slowly, heart pounding, trying to piece together what he'd stumbled into. The cellar felt like the hidden root of the house's corruption, a place where secrets festered in preserved glass and metal clamps. He could almost sense the ghosts of the enslaved women who had been brought here, their fear soaked into the walls, their voices trapped in the cold air. As he brushed past one of the birthing chairs, a faint metallic creak echoed behind him, though no draft touched the room. He turned sharply, but nothing had moved, nothing visible. Yet the unmistakable feeling settled over him that the cellar was not empty, that the horrors it once contained had never truly left, and that Madam Calhoun's obsession had carved these rooms into something far more sinister than a simple chamber of suffering. Samuel had always thought of forests as living things, but in the ravine's depths the woods felt alive in a way that defied nature. After discovering the cellar, he spent the night in a restless half-sleep, waking repeatedly to the sensation that something outside the mansion was circling closer. At dawn he stepped onto the sagging porch, desperate for air that wasn't thick with dust and dread. The moment he reached the yard's edge, the forest greeted him with a silence so deliberate it felt like a held breath. Then, as if triggered by his presence, the whispers began. They were faint at first, weaving through the leaves in thin threads of sound that mimicked the rustle of branches. But the more Samuel listened, the clearer they became, voices, unmistakably female, rising and falling in overlapping murmurs that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. He spun toward the source, expecting to find someone hidden among the trees, but the whispers shifted with each movement, slipping behind him, then ahead, as though the forest itself were speaking. Their tone was not angry or threatening, it was pleading. He could hear strains of desperation in the fragmented words, like cries trapped in a loop. At times the voices dissolved into a low moan carried by the wind, only to sharpen moments later into near whispers of his own name. The familiarity of that sound froze him. The voices didn't imitate him, they reached for him, as if recognizing a living presence among the dead air of the ravine. Trees that looked ordinary the day before now seemed subtly distorted. Their trunks bent inward, branches nodded in shapes he couldn't quite decipher but felt an instinctive dread toward. Moss clung to the bark in thick sheets that resembled decaying skin, and in places the roots broke through the soil like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost pulsing, as though something far below stirred at the sound of the voices. He noticed faint patterns in the dirt, small, repeated impressions resembling footsteps, but not fresh ones. They looked as if they had been pressed again and again over years, always in the same direction, always toward the mansion behind him. The whispers grew louder when he stepped closer to the tree line, as if urging him deeper into the woods. Some voices trembled with pain, others with warning. The most haunting were the ones that sounded like lullabies sung off-key by someone trying to soothe a child who would never wake. Samuel's pulse quickened. He could feel his heart beating in his ears, echoing in rhythm with the forest's murmured chorus. He called out once, unsure of what answer he expected, but the voices surged in response, overlapping so chaotically he staggered backward. When he retreated from the trees, a cold wind swept through the clearing, bending the branches inward as if the forest were reaching after him. The whispers faded, not disappearing entirely but slipping back into the woods like something temporarily restrained. Samuel sensed then that the forest did not merely echo the suffering of the missing women, it contained it. Their grief, their fear, their final moments had soaked into the roots and bark until the woods became a living conduit for their voices, forever seeking someone who might finally listen or finally escape. Samuel had tried to tell himself that Madam Calhoun's obsession was nothing more than a cruel eccentricity born of isolation and madness, but the truth revealed itself in fragments, each more disturbing than the last. It began with the journals he found hidden behind a loose panel in the cellar wall, leather-bound, swollen with age, the ink faded but legible. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant, yet each page trembled with a feverish urgency. Madam Calhoun had documented her fixation with an intensity that went far beyond fascination. She wrote of the radiance inside expectant bodies, of the purest form of life pulsing beneath the skin, and of her belief that the unborn carried a force that could be absorbed, redirected, or harvested. Her fascination had begun years earlier, after a series of miscarriages, each one leaving her more unhinged than the last. She became convinced that somewhere in the realm between life and death existed a power she could reclaim for herself, a power she believed nature had denied her. As Samuel read, horror settled over him like a second skin. The entries described rituals that blurred the boundary between medical procedure and spiritual violation. She spoke of drawing strength from the fear of the enslaved women she brought into the mansion, believing their terror ripened the life within them. There were chilling notations about timing, about energy, about the precise moment when the unborn rested closest to the threshold of the unknown. She claimed that proximity to such moments renewed her, allowed her body to retain what time attempted to steal. The words were delusional, yet the precision with which they were recorded suggested a mind consumed by purpose, not chaos. She had built her entire world around this twisted doctrine. But the most sickening revelation came not from the journals, but from Samuel's own observations. He noticed how Madam Calhoun's demeanor shifted whenever the muffled pounding beneath the floor echoed through the house. She became almost radiant, her dull, waxen skin flushing with unnatural warmth. Her eyes brightened, reflecting a hunger that felt more spiritual than physical. Samuel watched her reach out her hand as if absorbing something invisible in the air, drawing it into her like a starving creature inhaling sustenance. Her massive body, though frail in movement, seemed charged with an energy that contradicted her appearance. It was as though she existed in a state of constant feeding, her vitality tethered to something unseen and deeply unnatural. The truth struck Samuel with a force that left him trembling. She had not simply studied the presence of unborn life, she believed she could consume it, transform it into something that sustained her. The women she lured to the mansion were not victims of circumstance, they were offerings to a ritual she believed kept her alive. Each missing woman was another attempt to reclaim youth, power, and purpose. And the voices in the woods were the remnants of those attempts, echoes of souls torn from their bodies before their final breath could quiet. Samuel had always believed that if danger revealed itself plainly, a man could decide whether to fight or flee. But the horror at Madam Calhoun's estate did not come at him directly, it encircled him, tightening its hold with each passing hour until escape felt like a distant dream. After discovering the cellar, hearing the whispers in the forest, and reading the journals, he knew he needed to run. Yet the woods that had once felt like a possible way out now seemed to breathe with hostile intent. When he stepped toward the tree line at dusk, hoping to slip away under cover of darkness, the branches bent inward as if forming a living barrier. Leaves rustled in frantic patterns, and faint footprints, Those same small, countless imprints seemed to shift in the soil, aligning into pathways that guided not outward but back toward the mansion. Each step forward felt like wading into a trap. Night deepened quickly, faster than nature allowed, as though the ravine itself swallowed the light to keep him grounded in its depths. The voices in the woods rose again, louder than before, woven together in a dissonant chorus of warnings and laments. They didn't call his name this time. Instead, they pleaded for him to run, to break free before he became part of the cycle that bound them. But their urgency only made the shadows between the trees surge with movement. He glimpsed shapes, brief, flickering silhouettes that disappeared the moment he focused on them. It felt as though the remnants of the women who had suffered here were trapped in a terrible conflict, trying to guide him away while the forest, infused with the rituals performed within the mansion, fought to drag him back. Inside, Madam Calhoun lurched through the corridors with renewed vitality, her enormous frame gliding as though weightless on her wheeled chaise. The pounding beneath the floor grew more violent, as though something buried was sensing Samuel's attempt to flee. Doors slammed without wind, walls groaned, and cold drafts swept through the rooms with a predatory swiftness. The mansion felt awake, alert, almost eager. Samuel realized with a sickening clarity that whatever lived beneath the floorboards, whatever fed into Madam Calhoun's twisted rituals, had begun to stir in response to his fear. He felt the boards vibrate beneath his feet as he rushed toward the front door, only to find it stuck as though held by an unseen force. The final certainty settled over him like ice. He was no longer an intruder in Madam Calhoun's domain, he was a part of it, woven into the fabric of the ravine, the house, and the woods that whispered with the remnants of so many stolen lives. The voices of the women grew louder still, desperate, sorrowful, urging him to keep running even as the world around him closed like a tightening fist. And he understood in that moment that the mansion did not merely claim those who entered, it absorbed them, piece by piece, until escape became another story the forest whispered but never allowed to end.